Okay, we good. Thanks for stopping by, especially after lunch. So we're going to be talking about frogs and ducks. All right. Here's who I am. I've been with Black Duck for about 6 years now in various roles. Most recently, I'm working on our biz dev side as our technical director. And you can contact me in those various means. Best way is probably email. I don't tweet that often. I really just use it to keep tabs on my kids. So, and to tweet out pictures of pizza. But other than that, so first confession is I totally ripped off the title of this talk from a blog done by Rami. So it's a good blog if you want to learn more. I highly recommend it. But frogs and ducks, your Sentinels, depends on your accent, for open source security. I'm very sensitive to the fact that the feedback for these conferences, as well as others, is that there shouldn't be any sales pitches. So we're going to talk about Black Duck as much as you want. I've placed Black Ducks on your table, so if I start to get too salesy, feel free to pick one of those up and throw them at me. But just give me a heads up, because I can't see anything up here, so I can shield myself. Sounds good? Deal? And then if you do throw it at me, you get to keep the duck. All right? But the main part of the presentation really is a question. So my question to you is, who knows what a duck's natural habitat is? Anybody? What was it? Water, that's right. You get a duck. Ready? You sign that injury waiver? Nice catch. So I'm going to be going through 3 integrations that we have today currently with Black Duck software to JFrog. And if those are successful, we'll see this slide again, and we'll see if the duck can get to its natural habitat. All right. So that'll be the end slide. Before I get into it, I wanted to cover a recent vulnerability incident that occurred. Do we have any friends from Canada in the audience? Nobody? Okay, so I won't. So this occurred on their IRS, basically the Canadian Revenue Agency, CRA, the Apache Strutz vulnerability that hit in March. And I'm going to walk you through a timeline in reverse. And so taxes are due in Canada on the 30th, which was a couple weeks ago. And the CRA had to shut their site down on March 10th, so it was a Friday. And it was shut down for at least the entire weekend. I think they got it back up the next week. But it was this CVE. If you're not familiar with CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, they're enumeration numbers given to vulnerabilities, typically by the National Vulnerability Database. And so just to kind of show you that I'm not lying to you here, if we take a look at the NVD, and I'll zoom in here, you could see there's the date, 3/10, right? This is also reported in Black Duck as well, so you can see 3/10 here. Here's the CVE. Whoop. We'll go back. So that was the 10th. Interestingly enough, 3 days later, the public exploit was published. So public exploit is how you exploit this vulnerability. And it was out on GitHub, or it was somewhere actually out on an exploits database. So for 3 days, the site was up, and somebody could have gotten that exploit and got your tax information. The 5th and 6th, depending on what time zone you were, this is when the vulnerability was actually reported by this gentleman, Nike Zheng, who works in China for DB app security. And also, the reason why I have a duck there is because that's when Black Duck also were helping our customers with this vulnerability as well. So if we go back here, take a look at, this is our enhanced vulnerability data, and you can see March 5th is when we reported it as well. So the moral of the story in this slide is that the National Vulnerability Database is good if you're the government, not so good if you need to understand vulnerabilities pretty quickly, right? There's a resource issue with the folks at NIST, great people, but they don't get information out in a timely manner. So there's typically delays like 2 to 3 weeks after a vulnerability is reported. This was actually a pretty quick response time from the NIST. We've seen months and a couple months as well. So what we've been doing at Black Duck is sort of working our products to deliver this vulnerability information quicker, faster to our customers. So that's just one of the things I wanted to let you know. Now, the thing about vulnerabilities typically is that the known vulnerabilities on open source software are usually found by humans and not by automated techniques. So, for example, this gentleman, Mr. Zhang, found this one. If you look at things like Heartbleed and Drown and Shell Shock, they're naming these vulnerabilities now. Those are as well found by humans. Now, the other interesting thing to note about vulnerabilities is the amount of time that they're in the code. So if we take a look at when this was first introduced, if you look at the vulnerability information, it says 2.3.5 of Apache Struts was the first affected version. Anybody care to guess when that was introduced? 2012. So the vulnerability was actually in Apache Struts for 5 years now before somebody found it, and then obviously things were fixed. The interesting thing too is anybody know Nike Zhang? I tried to look him up, and I couldn't find much, but I found his GitHub site. So you have to hope that he's a good man, and that's what he says. He's a good man. So you would hope he's not spending his time exploiting things before he reports it. Anyway, so just a little bit of background on vulnerability data, the National Vulnerability Database, and sort of what to expect from those guys. All right, this is my company slide, so don't throw anything at me yet. Does anybody want to go through Black Duck as a company, or should we skip this slide and get closer to the demos? What do you guys think? Want me to go through this slide? Thumbs down? Demo, okay. Let's go to the next slide. Just one more thing. This is not sales, but this is free. So go pick this up at our booth. It's actually pretty nice. It's like an annual report we push out on stats for open source security and risk. And we do it based on the thousands of code applications that we analyze. So it's a good resource. If anything, it's educational. Check it out. The other thing, just from a confusion standpoint, just to give you a quick history of Black Duck's products, so in 2003, we came out with a product called Protex. It was a deep scanning capability that focused on license compliance primarily. And then a couple of years later, we put out a product called Code Center. Code Center was more of a governance tool with an automated workflow, and it had some security vulnerability information that was part of it. That did have an Artifactory Pro integration, but late last year we discontinued that support for that integration, and so there was confusion because about 5 years ago we started to build a new platform around all of our capabilities called the Black Duck Hub. The Black Duck Hub combines Protex and Code Center. We launched it 2 years ago, and it does have integrations, which I'll show you here, 3 integrations with the JFrog products. So just sort of in terms of understanding where Black Duck is. And the last thing before we get to the demo, just to help you understand, because I'll be talking about this in the different integrations that we have. When you're looking at finding open source in applications or containers, there's a couple problems with that to understand. Open source, and the main question is, how do you find that open source? Because there's open source that can be declared. So for example, in package managers or POM files, as well as package.json, certain programming languages have declarative type files. And certainly you can find open source that way. You can also find open source through dynamic means, meaning like in a build. So with your Maven POM file, if you have a POM that has high-level dependencies, you can look at that file and say, well, I see you have this, but you don't know the transitive dependencies, right, that come along with that build. So you want to, from a dynamic standpoint, you also want to look at what those high-level dependencies bring in. But that's actually not enough, right, to find all the open source in your applications, because not all open source is declared. So you have to have some sort of mechanism to scan your applications or your images to say, here's an open source file, here's an open source package that wasn't in these declared files. Just think about like client JavaScript or older languages that don't have sort of declarative files. And the thing that you notice is that, if you look only at declarative and dynamic type techniques, you're kind of programming language specific. But as you grow with an evidence-based model, you become more agnostic. So you can start, if you do the evidence-based capability right, you start to be able to find more programming languages. The other thing to note is that the depth and coverage increases as well as you add evidence-based scanning. So instead of just if you think about a container, instead of just looking at the operating system components, if you're scanning the entire container and you're taking hashes of the files and comparing it to what you have, your knowledge base, then your depth and your coverage of those containers will increase. So I just wanted to let you know, because our integrations that I'm going to show you use various techniques, and I'll use this terminology. Okay? And Black Duck is obviously in the middle. All righty. Let's do the demos. Don't forget to deploy before demo 1. Okay, the first demo is our Xray integration. And before I show you that, I need to just deploy a couple things inside Xray. So we will go to Xray here. And Artifactory. I'm going to deploy a couple things in Artifactory. I've got releases. First, I have to sign in. So just to show you that this is a real live instance. All righty. I am going to deploy in here, and I'm going to deploy this this one jar file. Let me select it here. This is Commons IO 2.4 jar. We're going to just go ahead and deploy that. I'm also going to deploy a node module. So I've got, you should be able to see this, right? I've got fun node packages. If you've ever done npm.js, you like want one and it gives you 10,000 node modules. So we're going to just dive into one here called shell quote, and I'm going to publish that bad boy into my Artifactory repository. So while those are deploying, or they already have, I'll talk about the use case here within this first demo. So this is if you have Xray and Artifactory. This integration basically adds Black Duck's enhanced vulnerability data alongside Xray's vulnerability data as well. And so anything that you deploy into Artifactory that you're watching with Xray will add the enhanced vulnerability data that we have. So a couple of things that you get with Black Duck. And as I mentioned, on top of the National Vulnerability Database, you get vulnerabilities that are published quicker. You also get more vulnerability information. So the National Vulnerability Database doesn't cover everything. And then I'll show a couple examples later on. You also get things like, what's the recommended solution for this vulnerability? Here's the exploit. Here's links to other relevant articles as well. So you get a lot of information with that vulnerability data. And this would be, development teams using the different CI tools, going into Artifactory and then Xray, watching it. And if you have something like a really cool Xray watch action, I've heard of, Slack actions, Jira actions, page my CISO action, whatever you got, you can add Black Duck into that environment. So, and the other cool thing we saw today was the IDE integration with IntelliJ, and our stuff should flow along pretty easily with that. So for the first demo, I'm sure I'm going to have to log in here. Oh, nope, but you can see I've got a couple alerts. I set up a couple of watches, my libs watch and my npm watch. And if I go to my alerts, you can see their commons IO was added and shellcode was added as well. So if we take a look at the issue, you'll notice that there's only one vulnerability here. The National Vulnerability Database did not report this as a vulnerability, and it's a critical one. So this is sort of the enhanced vulnerability information that you would get from Black Duck. In a similar matter, if we go back to shellquote, that's also a critical vulnerability as well. So this just added capability, complementary capability to what Xray provides as well into their interface. So that was the first demo. Now we'll move into, that was the first demo, yay. Now we'll go into the Artifactory plugin. So one thing I wanted to mention is that most of our integrations are open source. So if you can go out to github.com, Black Duck Software, and find all our integrations. Our two Artifactory integrations are actually packaged under one project, hub-artifactory, and please feel free to go out there and contribute if you'd like. We also have full documentation on this. This is all free now. This is actually something new. We've now published a lot of our documentation publicly out there as well. So the integrations are there. This integration we've named a build output scanner. So it's a very unique business case where three things are typically happening. One is you want to monitor your developer builds, and they're not going through a normal CI process. Maybe it's before they're submitting their code to CI process, and you want to find all the open source that they're developing. Maybe they're using technologies that don't use binary dependencies, or maybe they're doing client-side JavaScript. So, and they're deploying to Artifactory. So that's the typical use case. You can see there, demo 2, it's going straight to Artifactory. That's the developer builds, and you want to monitor those as well. So the build output scanner, that one is done through a Groovy script. It's a plugin that we've created, and if I take you through that Groovy script, this is what it looks like. And basically, you go into the Groovy script, and you are specifying certain things like your hub web server, where the results go, username, password, and then you add in, and this is kind of important as well, obviously what Artifactory repos to search. You can do multiple repos, and then what file type. So another sort of small use case is special file types that you can't aren't sort of standard in terms of scanning. And then what you do is you set and there's a cron job in here, a couple places here for when you want to scan. So you can scan these build outputs whenever, daily, hourly, every 5th day on every different month. So I've got it running every hour, so I deployed a couple things earlier today, and I'll show you what those are here in a minute. But then there's a couple other cron jobs to add a project version URL, so I'll show you that, as well as policy status. So within Black Duck, you can create different policies in order to control your components with different conditions. So for example, if you have a high priority application that's externally facing, you can create a policy to watch that as well. So if I go back to Xray, I'm sorry, Artifactory, I deployed a couple of projects here over the last couple of days. So email notifier is a zip application, and you can see I deployed it this morning at noon, well, noon my time, Eastern, so that was kind of in the morning. And then by and large, if anybody gets the reference, you know I have lots of kids who like Disney movies, but so by and large, I deployed a little bit later today. So what happens is when that cron job hits, it will basically take this artifact and download it and scan it and use the evidence-based scanning alongside any declarative scanning that we've baked in. So if it's, for example, if it's a zip file filled with package.json, we'll do the evidence and the declarative scanning within that as well. And so what happens is that then gets scanned, and the results, some results are sent back to Artifactory, which I'll show you in a minute, but the main results are sent in your hub web server. So if we take a look, see if those projects made it out here. Let's do by and large. So this is sort of a mismatch of an application, open source components. It's actually not a real application, but it's got C in here, it's got Java, Node.js, client side. You can see Castle Core, it's .NET stuff. And this is some of the type of the information that you get from Black Duck when you scan this stuff. So security risk, license risk, operational risk, and policy management as well. So we could see that this jQuery failed one of the policies, no external projects with reciprocal licenses. And you can configure those through the UI. But so that's by and large. The email notifier made it out here too. Let's take a look. Yeah, May 25th. And 2.0 is out here. And that also has some components that failed policies. And of course, you know, with Black Duck, you get all the information from a security standpoint. MVD and our enhanced vulnerability data information that has, you know, the solution, the recommendation, where all the other projects that are affected by this vulnerability occur, and so you get a lot of wealth of information in that sense. But if I go back to Artifactory and take a look at these, we put some property information on here as well, so you can keep track of when the scan occurred. Here's some URLs that take you back to the hub if you wanted to, as well as the policy status and in violation. So you can use those properties to automatically demote artifacts in Artifactory or promote them however you wish. So that's the first integration of that one package with Artifactory Pro. All right, that's demo 2. And then the third demo is what we're calling our Repo Inspector. The use case here is typically when you have this idea of a golden repo. And we've had customers who have wanted to have just one repo or 2 repos that this is where their golden bits are stored. And they don't want any bad things to be in there. And you've got multiple teams using going through your standard process, right? Using your CI tools and using Artifactory, and so they can only use artifacts from that golden repo. So we've had customers who said, I want this entire repo scanned, and so that's what our third integration looks like. So if we go to that one, the Repo Inspector is a command line tool. So we'll head over to our command line. And when you download the integration from our integration page, the jar file will be in there. And you can run the jar file by itself, Java jar, and it'll say, hey, you have to run these certain modes. So there's a couple modes. One is configure inspector. And you could do that as a one-time setup to configure what, for example, what Black Duck web server you're talking to, what are the parameters, and I can't talk and type at the same time. Things like timeout, working directory. It'll make sure you typed correctly. And then your connection to Artifactory Pro with the URL and password. And then what repositories you want to inspect. So we're going to look at external release local. Just to kind of show you that real quick. These are, we kind of looked at it before. There's over 20 jars in here that I've deployed. So we'll look at that one. Enter project name. Oh yeah, so we'll call this is what will show up in the hub. Demo, we'll just call it demo. And then a version, so if you don't specify a version, it'll be the current date. So again, you only have to run this once. It actually creates a properties file. So you could just build a properties file if you wanted to. And then you could automate this daily, hourly, if you wanted to, through the other mode, which is the run inspector mode. So you'll notice here that this is the mode that we're running when we ran configure inspector before. So I'm going to run that. It's a Spring Boot application, as was the configure, same application. But it's going to go out and query Artifactory. And in this case, it's using declarative techniques to find these jar files, package them up, and send them to our hub web server. So with the hub, you can use both declarative or evidence-based. You can use them together as well. Declarative is typically faster because it's just doing ID lookups. And so you could see, let me see if I can wrench this down a little bit. Yeah, these are, so you can see it wrote all these different jars. That means it's writing the ID information to a file that we are pushing out. So if I go over to our hub, and let's see if the project is out there. It is. So May 25th, and last updated May 25th, and then voila, we've got 21 artifacts here, now all managed by Black Duck, and you're given all the different enhanced security, vulnerability, license risk, operational risk. So that is the third use case for Black Duck. We'd love to hear about more use cases. So if you have any ideas for us or have other use cases, please come talk to us. The last thing to chat about is I was actually in a sales engineering role for the last 6 years and talked to many customers, and especially on the enterprise level. And the diagrams never seem like this clean when you're mapping out what they do. So for example, you've got multiple teams that are kind of doing their own thing, right? They're not following the process, trying new technologies, using all sorts of build techniques. You've got your Microsoft teams who like their Microsoft tools and don't want to have anything to do with your silly CI Jenkins, where as well as they've got their own sort of repo. And then you've got, other folks who want to centralize security data or any sort of issues and things like Jira or security type technologies like Fortify, AppScan, ThreadFix. Then, you've got these innovation teams and you don't know what they're doing, or or your company just acquired like 2 other companies, and now you don't even know how many other development teams you have, and you don't know what they're doing, but they're talking about Scala and Python, and maybe even some older teams are talking about Fortran. And then now you've got these teams trying to do things like containers and Kubernetes, and what is all this stuff? And sometimes these teams are not even on the same page, right? They're all over the map. And before you know it, you've got 60 plus programming languages in your enterprise. So that's what I've typically seen. And so what do you do, right? Because you've got all this open source all over the place. And people aren't sticking to your standards of DevOps. And so how do you conquer that? Well, I mean, obviously, you fly in the flock, right? So this is my cheap advertisements for Black Duck. And then what happens is you've conquered your open source. So this slide is just kind of a reality check on the DevOps lifecycle and Black Duck's ability to sort of integrate at all certain levels, from the IDE all the way to sort of OpenShift and deployment. So that was it. So the last thing, I know I'm pretty early, right? Right on time? Okay. Yeah, I guess the last thing is, let's see if we can get the duck to fly to its natural habitat. Are there any marketing folks here? Because if so, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm messing with logos. Here we go. All right. We did it. All right, so that's it. Any questions? Any questions? So in this presentation, which I gave to Jerry, there's an appendix full of features that I didn't want to bore you with, if you're interested in Black Duck. So everything from what we do, identification, all the way to alerting. But happy to take any questions that you have. Yes, thank you.
So for demo 1, is it just the Black Duck database that you're using with Xray, or is there data going back to the hub as well?
Yeah, great question. For the first integration, it's just data from our knowledge base. So yeah, essentially a data feed. You do have to have the hub, though, in order to use it. Great question. Anything else? All right. Well, if not, hey, I appreciate it. I'll let you guys get about 10 minutes back in your schedule.
And if you can fill out the review on the session, just give your feedback so we can continuously improve for next year. We really value everybody's feedback. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Please take the ducks. Thanks.